This is part of the webinar series from the Association of Southeast Asian Studies in the UK. I'm very happy this morning to welcome participants from the UK, from Southeast Asia, and wherever else you're joining us. We have a great speaker this morning, Chris Chaplin, a senior research analyst at the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, somebody very familiar with Indonesia, having done research for many years on a variety of topics. And I'm delighted that Chris is with us this morning or this late afternoon in Indonesia to talk about an analysis of COVID-19 and political polarization in Indonesia, with particular emphasis on the mobilization of Islamic organizations, various networks and alliances, either in support of or in opposition to Jokowi, and basically the complexity as we try to navigate through this very challenging pandemic. So this, I think, is a very topical and very, very relevant event. And I'm very delighted to have our speaker. Basically, the housekeeping is straightforward. We have roughly a half an hour to hear from our speaker, followed by a Q&A session. And our various moderators are going to be receiving your questions on Facebook, and we will collate those and do our best to cover as much as possible in the remaining half an hour when we have the Q&A. So I don't want to drag this out any longer. I think we should move straight to our speaker. So at this moment, I invite Chris to join us, and I thank him a lot. And we look forward to hearing the talk this morning and then having an engaging Q&A session afterwards. And we'll run up until 11 o'clock GMT. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Adam, and thank you everyone in the ASEAS UK for this invitation to present today. And good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are, to everyone. So just briefly to introduce myself, my name is Chris Chaplin, and I'm a senior research analyst focusing on Southeast Asia or maritime Southeast Asia for the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. With this, there's a bit of a disclaimer that what I'm talking about today is not official policy or the opinions of the UK government. In fact, prior to joining as a research analyst at the FCDO, I was an academic researcher, so this is pretty much based on an extension of my academic research. So today I'd like to talk about COVID-19 and political polarization in Indonesia. And just briefly to kind of kick off with this, it's good to kind of just like place where Indonesia stands in terms of what's happening in the world in the global pandemic. So in this sense, Indonesia is not very dissimilar to a lot of other countries in the world. In fact, we're seeing a series of health, economic, and political challenges related to COVID-19. So in terms of health, last week, Indonesia, according to the World Health Organization, Indonesia had roughly 450,000 cases. I think that's gone up to 470,000 on latest estimates. And this is the largest kind of number of cases that we see in Southeast Asia. So in that sense, there is a health impact that is happening with this. However, we should add a bit of context because in absolute terms, Indonesia is the fourth largest nation in the world, but yet, and these cases are quite high. But if we compare them to the US or say Brazil, countries with almost similar kind of populations, they're actually quite low in this sense. But nevertheless, there are challenges when it comes to health infrastructure and access to health. So this is something serious. Now, similarly with the economy, Indonesia in October, they reported that the gross domestic product, or the GDP, has shrunk by 1.5% over 2020. If we compare this to the estimated average 5% rise of growth that they were expecting every year, we can see that this kind of is a decrease as well. So much like the rest of the world, there is an economic impact here. And this has put an estimated 400 Indonesians below the poverty line. The government has also had to increase borrowing in this sense to try and recover from COVID-19. So there is an economic impact. But yet again, in absolute terms, Indonesia is faring a bit better than a lot of other countries that we're seeing across the world. So it's good to kind of contextualize this too. And finally, much like the rest of the world, Indonesia is also seeing a political impact. And we could see this in the initial stages of the pandemic in March. where the government was criticized for being too slow to react to COVID-19. And you saw this kind of tension kind of build out between the national government and provincial governments that wanted to have harsher or stricter measures put in place quicker, including what we saw with Papua and with the governor of Jakarta, Anies Baswedan. So you saw this tension kind of play out. But again, we need to remember that Jokowi does remain politically strong. In fact, his approval ratings remained at about 58%, according to the Survey Institute. And this is despite the fact that Indonesians are also quite critical about the way that the government has handled COVID-19. Also, in terms of his political base, he maintains a broad coalition of parties in parliament and actually has a supermajority of 471 seats. So President Jokowi is fairly stable in that sense. The other big key aspect when we're looking at kind of political rivalries is the fact that his big-time political rival, Prabowo Subianto, who he ran against twice, Jokowi ran against twice in presidential elections in 2014 and 2019. Prabowo is now within the government. He is the defense minister. So Jokowi has brought him into the tent and therefore kind of dampened that political opposition. However, having said this, there are two sources of opposition towards Jokowi that we can see within the Indonesian public sphere at this point. Now, the first one of these is amongst students and civil rights activists that have been critical of Jokowi and the government's handling of COVID-19, but also in the way that they've kind of clamped down on criticism of the government's kind of response to COVID-19. But also more kind of recently, we've seen kind of demonstrations on the streets in Indonesia concerning kind of the way that the government passed a labor law with very little kind of consultation with civil society. So this is one area of critique that we see within the Indonesian public sphere. And the second area of critique, which is actually what I'm going to focus on today, that is in conservative Islamic circles or organizations and supporters of what broadly we can define as Muslim majoritarianism. So before I move on, I should just define what I mean by Muslim majoritarianism here. What I'm talking about is not essentially an explicit Islamist project of turning Indonesia into an Islamic state, but a wholesale re-imaging of what Indonesia actually is and what the nation's founded on. And what they're doing here is they're foregrounding the rights of Islamic or kind of Muslim Indonesians or pious Muslim Indonesians within the public sphere, and restricting access or wanting to restrict access to the public sphere and access to public offices to people that follow the correct Muslim kind of path. It's a very broad church. There's no way really of defining it. It's not institutionalized, but it does pick up on what Jeremy mentioned as a godly nationalism. The fact that to be Indonesian in their eyes, it relates to being a proper kind of religious individual. Now, to put this into context a bit further, an Islamic political project in Indonesia isn't necessarily something new. In fact, you've seen this from the kind of early and late colonial periods up until the kind of brief parliamentary period in the 1950s to kind of opposition and outright rebellion as well with the Darul Islam. And I don't really necessarily want to focus on this, but I put some kind of readings out there like John Seidel's Riot, Pogroms and Jihads, for example, Remy Madina's book on the Masyumi Party, as well as Kevin Fogg's excellent work on the revolution and Islamic organizations. And if anyone's interested, I thoroughly encourage you to read those works. But what I'm going to focus on here today predominantly deals with the democratic periods of the 21st century, or more accurately, 1998. So what we've seen in this period is the rise of new Islamic parties. So this is the Moon and Crescent Party, for example, the Prosperous Justice Party, that have links to kind of Muslim Brotherhood ideas and ideologies. These parties have risen up. They hold seats in parliament in kind of provincial areas too, but they necessarily haven't kind of been that successful in putting forward a Islamic agenda. Nevertheless, they are there, they are present, and they are part of the political dialogue at the moment. Now, what we've seen as well at this point is the increase in religious bylaws. And this is something that Michael Buller at SOAS has concentrated on specifically, and he's identified over 400 that we can see across Indonesia. Now, what we mean by religious bylaws in this sense are laws that look at morality, religious education, prohibition of, say, alcohol, for example. And we can see these being passed predominantly at the provincial and kind of local regency level by politicians that want to kind of co-opt what they see as a Muslim vote. So you see this increasing kind of idea of Islam in the kind of political sphere. Now, combined with this, we see a growing kind of Islam in the public sphere, be that through TV channels, religious consumerism, and kind of products that we're seeing in bookshops, book fairs, and so forth. And finally, something else that we're noticing within the democratic period is, and this particularly kind of relates to the predecessor of our current president, Joko Widodo or Jokowi, and that being Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono. We saw an increase in government funding for Islamic organizations, and not just the traditional Islamic organizations, Muhammadiyah and Nahdlatul Ulama, but a wide kind of birth and plethora of different organizations with different doctrines that are fairly conservative in certain elements. So what this all kind of meant was that during the presidency and the tenure of Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, you saw this growing kind of conservative turn within the Indonesian public and political sphere. Now, again, this wasn't a predominantly kind of Islamist project, but you saw the idea of morality and kind of deviance raise its head. So, for example, religious minorities came under increasing pressure. You also had kind of new legislation such as the anti-pornography laws in 2008. And these really kind of gained kind of traction within this time. However, the idea of Muslim majoritarianism really kind of crystallized as a project, I'd say, around 2014 in the presidential campaign between President Jokowi and his then rival Prabowo Subianto. Now, Prabowo Subianto, or Prabowo, was able to kind of co-opt a lot of these groups, these conservative Islamic groups, who then went out of their way to paint Jokowi as anti-Islamic. I shouldn't say anti-Chinese, that should say anti-Indonesian, but they painted him as somewhat kind of a Chinese fifth column within a lot of their social media campaigns, and really kind of put that out there for him. It did fail. Jokowi won. Prabowo didn't concede, but he lost. But yet this Muslim majoritarianism as a force was finding its kind of ground and traction. And this really kind of came to a head 2 years later in Jakarta in the gubernatorial elections against Jokowi's then ally, Ahok, the governor, who is Christian of ethnic Chinese minority. Now, amongst Muslim groups at the time, they opposed Ahok because they saw Jakarta as a Muslim majority city, therefore it should have a Muslim governor, Ahok not being that. So when it came to the elections, they really kind of took to the streets. You saw 500,000 people in December 2016. We've got a picture here on the left of that. And they really kind of came together, kind of denounced Ahok as a blasphemer, saying that he had kind of criticized the Quran, but also kind of engaged with Muslims through study circles, through newspaper, through media, to tell those in Jakarta that it was an obligation of Muslims to vote for a Muslim candidate. And inevitably Ahok lost. Now from this, they kind of mobilized and saw this as their first victory. And they had this idea of then kind of moving forward and actually influencing the 2019 presidential elections. So once Ahok was out of the way, Jokowi was going to be their next target. And that was their aim. So just briefly before we turn to 2019 onwards, it's worth kind of just pulling out and extrapolating who was in this kind of anti-Ahok, kind of anti-Jokowi alliance. And you see three different groups that kind of came together loosely. Now, firstly, this included political actors who aimed to capitalize on this Islamic narrative for their own interests. So as I mentioned, Prabowo was key in kind of organizing these groups, as was his Gerindra party at the time. And the Anies Baswedan, who became governor of Jakarta after defeating Ahok, also kind of rode on the coattails of this movement. He was their preferred candidate, and they were successful in mobilizing enough people to back him. Another group of people that you saw was what's been termed the Salafi modernist scholars. Now, this is a bit disingenuous because they're not just Salafi. You get a bit of influence of the Muslim Brotherhood and other conservative kind of intellectual tracks within this, but they're predominantly linked to the Indonesian kind of organization of young ulama and intellectuals, the MUMI. For those that are familiar with Indonesia, some names here would be Bakta Nasir and Muhammad Zaitun Razmi, the head of Wadha Islamiyah. Now, these groups are highly intellectual. They predominantly work through educational institutes across Indonesia. They run study circles within tertiary education universities, but most of them have also been educated abroad in places like Saudi Arabia and the Middle East. So for them, this is an ideological kind of movement. This is a discursive battle. They really wanted to see kind of Islam kind of on a grassroots level increase throughout Indonesia. And a third group that's worth mentioning are the conservative traditionalists and Islamists that are able to kind of organize mass mobilization. So for example, here, the Islamic Defenders Front and Habib Rizek come to mind. And these are groups that are experienced in bringing a lot of people onto the streets, quick notice, and usually being quite controversial in their tactics. So one of the reasons that you saw a success in 2016 and 2017 was that these actors worked together through financing, through creating a narrative, through bringing people to the streets when they needed to be. And through this, there's this idea that actually we're going to now move against the president. And you could see this through the trending hashtag throughout 2018 to 2019 through the GANTIPRESIDEN or Change President campaign. And just one example of this here on the left, this is a Tabligh Akbar, or a great gathering that happened in Makassar in 2018, which talked about the need to have a new president, have a president who they saw it as being pro-ulama, i.e. pro-Muslim. So they were laying the groundwork here for what was happening. However, at the same time, you saw the movement fragment for several reasons. Now, firstly, the movement did shock the Jokowi administration into action, and several of these actions were quite restrictive towards this group. So, for example, Habib Rizek, the head of the Islamic Defenders Front, was charged, or was being investigated, sorry, on a number of charges, including blasphemy against Christianity, as well as sending pornographic material. So he upped and went to Saudi Arabia, where he remained for 3 years, well, up until last week, in self-proclaimed exile. Bakr Nashir, another one that was mentioned in the Salafi modernist circles, you saw money laundering charges being leveled over his head. And at the more explicit end, the government actually outright banned Hizb ut-Tahrir Indonesia for being anti-Pancasila, anti the Indonesian national ideology, if you can see that. And kind of attached to this as well, you saw political actors such as Prabowo, Anies Baswedan. They were actually unable to protect most of these allies in themselves. So that kind of led to a fragmenting on that kind of political angle. Also, what you saw with Anies Baswedan becoming governor is that he was quite happy to have these individuals around him, quite happy to have them support him. They did have an open door policy, but that necessarily didn't turn into seats in institutions or influence over certain kind of parts of the administration. You also, another reason that you had internal fragmentation at this time was concerns over the direction of the movement. And you saw this particularly within the Salafi modernist circles that had previously dedicated themselves to more grassroots activism. So what happened there was your kind of more local kind of leaders of study circles got concerned that the new priority seemed to be demonstrations in the street and thought that they were becoming overtly political and being manipulated. So you saw these organizations almost have an internal debate and kind of almost revert back to their old kind of method, becoming quite uncomfortable with their explicit kind of political position. And finally, within the kind of loose coalition, you saw tension over what type of Islamic doctrine should be there. And you saw this again between conservative traditionalists and Salafi modernists, who Salafi modernists in themselves are very much kind of against kind of what they see as traditional established values in Indonesia, and are also vehemently against Shia kind of beliefs and so forth. And Islamic traditionalists have a different approach to this. So you saw this kind of tension over which type of doctrine should we actually kind of follow. So all these kind of aspects kind of played out in the background. Having said that, up until 2019 and the presidential campaign, you did see some type of coordination, at least, on trying at least to kind of move against Jokowi. Not on the same kind of energy that you saw against Ahok, but you saw this kind of happening. However, two aspects kind of undermined their whole message and pretty much left them kind of in the dirt afterwards. Now, firstly, this was the fact that Jokowi himself kind of chose, or somewhat was forced upon him, was Maruf Amin, a conservative Islamic cleric who became his choice for vice president. Now, with Maruf Amin by his side, it was very difficult to tarnish Jokowi as somewhat being kind of anti-ulama. He had one of the most distinguished ulama running right next to him. And secondly, after the elections too, President Jokowi kind of reached out, provided an olive branch to his defeated rival at the time, Prabowo Subianto, and offered him kind of an in into the coalition. And by Prabowo coming into the coalition, he essentially abandoned these this loose Islamic alliance by themselves. And we can kind of see this perhaps in a comparative kind of aspect of the number of people that took to the street between 2016 and 2019. So in these two pictures here, these were from the original demonstrations that we saw against Ahok in Jakarta, where on the left here, 500,000 people approximately took to the streets. And this is another picture of these protests. And in 2019, when they wanted to kind of have a reunion event to commemorate this 2016 uprising, less than 10,000 people turned up. So you really saw it kind of somewhat disintegrate. And at the beginning of 2020, it really looked like this Muslim majoritarianism was somewhat on the back burner, somewhat kind of relegated of some sort. But then, and this is the final bit that I want to kind of concentrate on here, COVID-19, as it did around most of the world, kind of shifted the political environment and the way that kind of people debated about what was kind of happening, and kind of were able to kind of criticize kind of the government for their kind of interactions. And you saw this within the three circles that I talked about briefly. So I want to focus on each one of them to show you what they were doing. So firstly, amongst these Salafi modernist kind of organizations, you saw them being kind of somewhat subtly critical of the government's response, being slow and ineffective. And you saw that in March and April 2019, when Governor of Jakarta, Anies Baswedan, criticized Jokowi for being too slow and tried to implement his own social distancing measures within Jakarta. Now, these Salafi modernist organizations like Wadha Islamiyah fully supported Anies Baswedan and believed that you needed to kind of have these strict kind of COVID regulations in place. So they advocated for social distancing, they advocated for closing mosques, even when mosques weren't necessarily had to be closed, and they moved most of their events online. Now, one of the reasons they were behind this kind of more scientific approach is because a lot of these people actually kind of are recruited and come from science-based faculties in universities, including kind of medical faculties. So what you actually saw them do as well in terms of COVID was mobilize to provide medical supplies, food, provide social care, send doctors out into the community. So they've actually been fairly proactive in this sense as well as running an online media campaign in terms of coordination and fundraising. We can see here a picture on the left of several of these individuals distributing PPE. So they're quite proactive in this sense. It's also important to remember that they did at the same time maintain a grassroots campaign to promote conservative values with this kind of policy. They weren't necessarily directly explicit or in their criticism towards Jokowi, but they were subtly critical of the anti-science approach as they saw it. They've also used these kind of forums as well to target specific legislation. For example, they supported in 2019, early 2020, a piece of legislation that went forward that would essentially give religious preachers or Islamic preachers somewhat a bit of immunity in terms of what they preach and not being kind of criminalized for it. So you saw these kind of things kind of enter their campaigns, but most of this is still online as we see it. Now, in comparison, the conservative traditionalists, for example, like the Islamic Defenders Front that I'm talking about, somewhat kind of shifted their approach back and forth. So initially, like the Salafi modernists, you saw this kind of support for Anies Baswedan and this idea of social distancing. However, this somewhat quickly reversed as they started to pick out the kind of contradictions that they saw in the kind of national government policy. For example, the government allowed factories to be open and essential workplaces. So from their argument, there is the question of like, well, if these places are essential, why isn't a mosque essential? So suddenly you saw them kind of picking out these criticisms and kind of support the opening of mosques and kind of moving forward in that sense. You also saw them provide medical supplies and food parcels to local communities. A lot of these groups work in kind of more impoverished areas, in urban areas such as Jakarta, and they were able to kind of distribute kind of food and medical supplies where needed. And finally, one thing that you have seen, and you're seeing it increasingly, is mobilization in the streets against legislation that they oppose. So for example, in June 2019, against government plans to revise the regulations surrounding the national ideology, Pancasila. They took to the streets in that case. And then more recently against changes and amendments in Indonesia's labor laws. And you can see a picture of that here on the right. And the final group I want to kind of talk about here are the political opponents. Now, the links that you saw on the kind of national level with prominent figures such as Prabowo Subianto might go, but the fact that there still seems to be several kind of figures courting these Islamic organizations that have national aspirations. So we're seeing this quite a lot on local level politics, but on the national front, I'd say that there are three kind of people to point out here that are worth considering for any type of future kind of analysis of the situation. Now, firstly, Anies Baswedan, the governor of Jakarta. He has been a vocal critic of Jokowi's handling of COVID-19 and kind of staked somewhat of his political reputation on kind of opposing the government at the time. He was very vocal. And he does maintain an open door policy with most of these groups. We can see him in this picture here, meeting with them. So a second individual that's worth mentioning is Gatot Nurmantio, who is a former general and head of the Indonesian Armed Forces. Now, in 2019, he had a failed attempt at running for president, but he's also kind of courted many of these groups previously. Now, he is a leading member in what has become the Koalisi Aksi Menyelamatkan Indonesia, or the Action Committee to Save Indonesia, which has become increasingly vocal against the government. In fact, when it came to the labor laws, several members of the KAMI were actually taken on critical kind of charges for spreading false information. And Gatot Nurmantio is potentially using this as kind of a vehicle for political aspirations. Now, in KAMI, it's worth noting that Bacta Nasir, that Salafi modernist, is in this kind of group. So you do see this kind of crossover there too. A final person to point out here is Amin Rais. Now, for all those familiar with Indonesian history and the Reformasi, or the Reform movement in 1998, he needs no introduction. He was a leading member of the Reform movement. He is a former head of Muhammadiyah, Indonesia's second largest Islamic organization, and he's a distinguished lecturer at the Gadjah Mada University in Yogyakarta. He was also a founding member of the PAN party in 1999. However, PAN has now disintegrated, and he's formed a new party called the Umat Party. Umat meaning kind of the Muslim kind of Ummah. So you can see these Islamic connotations here. Now, Amin Rais has been a vocal critic of Jokowi in the past, and he has turned up to mosque lectures with Salafi modernists and conservative traditionalists, pushing that line. We saw that in 2016, and more recently when he went to the house of Habib Rizek a couple of days ago to kind of greet him on his return to Indonesia. So these are three kind of aspects that show you that there are still potentials for kind of links there. And this kind of raises the question of whether a new alliance can be reborn. And there are certain cross-movement grievances that could kind of appeal to all these kind of groups. So, for example, the government's handling of COVID-19 has come under criticism by them all. We can also see a hostility towards national legislation, be that the labor law, be that the plans to reinvent or kind of reorientate Pancasila. We also see a broad support for this Muslim majoritarianism still there in its loosely defined terms. And we can also see them working together on issues of international grievances. So, for example, when it comes to aspects like the Rohingya, and more recently in calling for a national boycott of French products. So you see these cross-movement appeals kind of happening in this kind of cases. However, there's a big but on whether they can be brought together again. And that's the fact that they lack any singular unifying political kind of grievance or ideology. So Muslim majoritarianism might appeal to them, but the finer points of what that means are still quite blurry. And in fact, one of the reasons that you saw them being very successful against Ahok was the fact that him being a Christian, him potentially kind of blaspheming against Islam, provided a kind of grievance that could kind of unify this whole movement. And you need to kind of see that again if they were going to come together and kind of ignore their differences. A second point is the fact that Jokowi's hold on power and the way that he was able to kind of, his administration was able to kind of clamp down on part of this anti kind of Ahok movement. has raised the stakes in the game. You can put your head out, you can kind of oppose Jokowi, but the stakes of doing so at the moment are quite high. So, I mean, that counts against them too, and there are kind of evident risks in doing so. A final aspect is that many of these Islamic groups have been burnt before in being abandoned. So they might be unwilling to kind of actually, if politicians are unwilling to actually kind of give something for their support, be those positions in kind of in an administration or some sort, they might not be willing to kind of give their support, explicit support for something. So we can see that there's still kind of tension there on what each party will gain. But at the same time, the discursive battle over the role of Islam in Indonesia continues to be played out. And this means that this kind of idea of kind of Muslim majoritarianism isn't going to go away anytime soon. It's there in the background, and it continues to kind of gain traction. And we can see that in the numerous online lectures that they're holding at the moment, be they here on the left, for example, talking about COVID and how to recover and what a post-COVID Indonesia might mean, to more explicit kind of nationalist kind of ideas of kind of redefining Indonesian kind of history, redefining kind of the role of Islam in Indonesia, seeing it as a kind of an inherently kind of Muslim kind of state. And they hold lectures online quite a lot about these type of events here. And we can see them actually kind of re-engaging with aspects of Indonesian history. So for example, here on the bottom right, Muhammad Natsir, who was a prominent Islamist kind of politician and Indonesia's first prime minister, has been kind of like figured out or kind of singled out, and so, someone that they're reflecting on to show that actually Islam and being Indonesian and Indonesian nationalism is quite coherent, and they kind of can come together. And finally, another point to kind of show that this is kind of quite potent, and this is something that kind of happened last week when I was putting together the slides, is we saw Habib Rizek, the head of the Islamic Defenders Front, come back to Jakarta. And he was greeted by thousands of people at the airport. And since then, there have been thousands of people gathering on the streets, kind of celebrating his return from 3 years of self-imposed exile in Saudi Arabia. Now, although he has to kind of self-isolate because he's returned from Saudi Arabia with new COVID regulations, who was one of the first people to visit him? It was Anies Baswedan, the governor of Jakarta, who we can see here on the left. And so you can see that while perhaps the political clout or the kind of mobilizational potential of Muslim majoritarianism isn't what it once used to be, these figures in charge of it still hold a lot of political influence. In fact, Habib Rizek has been visited by Amin Rais, by members of Kami. There's been quite a few people that have actually turned up to pay tribute to him. And as we are now approaching, we're about 2 weeks away from the 4th anniversary of the massive protest that we saw against Ahok, the 212, or 2nd of December kind of protests where 500,000 people took to the streets. We're already seeing this battle in kind of between kind of government administrations and the FPE about holding another kind of rally, holding a reunion rally. So it is playing out again in Indonesia's kind of media, in the kind of political sphere, and it's showing that it remains a potent force. So I'm going to leave it there for questions, and I'm going to thank you and kind of leave you with a picture of just how many people greeted Habib Rizek at the airport when he came back last Tuesday. So thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much. Okay, let me adjust this. Thank you so much, Chris. Very fascinating stuff. So we are now going to enter the Q&A session. And one thing I was putting off until sort of this midway point was just to say that this event is brought to you and all of you by the Association of Southeast Asian Studies. We are a registered charity here in the UK, and I think included in your invitation to today's event was a link for you if you're in a generous mood or feeling at all interested in looking at the programs we run. We do have a donations link. So what we do as an association, among other things, is have an annual Research Impact Award, and we target Southeast Asian-based researchers, and we try to give opportunities to graduate students, PhD students, early career researchers, to encourage them to broaden their profiles, get experience, and so we do try to support that. So please donate if you are able to. Yep, and we are going to be taking questions through the chat as well as the live Facebook stream, and some of our staff today will help with that. And so while we're waiting for those to come in, let me just monitor the chat myself. I can start by saying to Chris, in a way, it's adding complexity, but it's also, you know, really interesting time, because as you alluded to, some major developments last week with the heroic return of a very contentious figure in politics, and we see, you know, massive congestion and presumably breaching of COVID restrictions to welcome the Islamic Defenders Front head back from 3 years in Saudi Arabia. One big question is what happened in those 3 years. You know, yeah, that's for another time. But I think it's rather ironic, and perhaps Chris, you have a view on this, that in the midst of school closures and indeed strict quarantine rules, we have, you know, the governor paying a personal visit to somebody while, again, regular households are enduring a lockdown and having schools closed. I mean, that strikes me as in itself rather problematic.
Yeah, no, definitely.
Yeah, indeed. And yeah, I mean, that's just more of an observation, but I'm just wondering more broadly, because we're thinking here in terms of large constituencies. How has the kind of messaging with the various, you know, Islamic or Muslim mass organizations, how has the messaging gone? Because essentially, to express opposition to the current administration, you can of course say, well, there were problems with the handling of COVID, but how are these groups also reconciling the pressures that their own constituents face? So, for example, public health and well-being is obviously near the top of the priorities, but at the same time, the hardship that lockdowns present, and you know the missed opportunities, the foregone income, and a lot of people do work in informal sectors. How do you kind of pitch this as, you know, the government's done the wrong thing, we need to criticize them, but at the same time, the audience we're speaking to are people who probably are fairly skeptical about the lockdown. So have you noticed a kind of core tension there between the messaging, the health and science on the one hand, and the economic livelihoods, well-being argument on the other?
Yeah, and you also notice kind of contradictions depending on the Islamic organization here as well. So some are pointing towards kind of, they want a stricter lockdown, they want this to be purely following the science, but also like within those groups, they're predominantly kind of from more, I don't want to use the term, but more kind of middle-class professional kind of backgrounds. So in terms of working from home, kind of maintaining kind of jobs of stability of some sort, they're probably in an easier position than most Indonesians, and they also have volunteer opportunities to kind of go out there and kind of help kind of organizations, so they can kind of give something back. So for them, the narrative is pretty coherent, and so forth. It becomes more challenging, I think, when you're talking about Islamic schooling or kind of more impoverished communities, predominantly kind of very built up kind of urban areas where social distancing is very difficult to maintain in the best of times, right? And there you're seeing this larger kind of tension of exactly what to do. And you saw that at the beginning of kind of national kind of restrictions, where initial support for closing mosques that were considered in red zones, i.e. hotspots for COVID-19, was supported with the caveat that, well, if we're living outside of these kind of areas, then we should somewhat continue on, go to mosque, continue to have these activities. But as kind of these tensions kind of built up, and they saw this kind of playing out on the kind of in people's lives, yeah, there has been this push actually of if not completely opening up, at least kind of trying to kind of maintain and kind of increase the kind of welfare support that these individuals can get. And this is through handing out kind of food, providing medical supplies, providing ambulances when they need them, and so forth. And so there is this tension, and I don't think one organization or the other has kind of like found a solution to it. They're all kind of navigating it on day out, day in kind of basis. But I think this idea maybe perhaps of class or kind of where Islamic organizations work and with which communities really kind of almost defines how they're kind of playing out and listening to the science.
Great. We do have one question that's going to kind of cast our gaze slightly further, and it's more of a comparative question. Essentially, we have from the audience a comparative question looking at Indonesia and Malaysia. I'm not sure, Chris, how far we can stretch this here, but it's basically saying, all right, this phenomenon of Muslim majoritarianism, are we witnessing similar developments, for example, in Malaysia and other countries, or is Indonesia somewhat of an outlier here?
So there are, you can draw kind of commonalities with Malaysia, and with the caveat that there is a bit of a difference here just because of the way that kind of Islamic organizations and Islamic authority is structured in Malaysia, that being far more hierarchical, with kind of sultans and kind of sitting in the states with muftis below them, kind of implementing kind of Islamic laws, which you don't have in Indonesia. So with that caveat, you can see commonalities, and you can see that kind of playing out in the fact that when the Pakatan Harapan, the previous kind of administration in Malaysia, took power, you saw this kind of increasing kind of alliance between kind of Malay nationalists and more Islamist kind of elements that came together and have kind of pushed forward this kind of Malay nationalism with these underlying tones of Islam and kind of Sharia in their place. And there are commonalities here with what you see in Indonesia. You've seen preachers kind of move to and from between the two countries on this. So there is that difference, but with the big caveat that politics, kind of Islamic authority, are very different in both countries. But yeah, there's definitely a comparative element there.
Mm-hmm. Great, we have a few more questions coming in. Thank you for that. We have a PhD student who has written in and said, I guess it's within this context that you presented, what is the likelihood of Muslim parties kind of consolidating in the run-up to 2024, the next round of elections? And what is the likelihood of a sort of unifying figure within all of these various Islamic movements, kind of bringing this together and creating, as you were suggesting, perhaps a new figurehead for one of these coalitions?
Mm-hmm. No, that's a fascinating question, and also one that speaks to the kind of the challenges of Indonesian politics at the moment. So, as mentioned, Jokowi has a supermajority in parliament, and parliament, essentially, you need kind of a specific amount of kind of votes or kind of support and backing in parliament to be nominated as a presidential candidate. At the moment, the Prosperous Justice Party, kind of one of the few opposition parties, doesn't have enough seats by themselves to put forward a candidate. So the idea of Islamic parties themselves, or Islamist parties themselves, being able to select a presidential candidate to kind of compete in the next election it's somewhat implausible unless you see the kind of Jokowi's kind of coalition break away some sort into bits. But even then, those aspects within that coalition, for example, parties like Gerindra, have enough influence that they'll probably want to put forward their own candidate. So in order for kind of this Islamist agenda to kind of go forward, you are going to see a fair bit of kind of political horse trading that will need to happen behind the scenes. And there has to be that type of compromise as well, because they just don't have the numbers at the moment to put forward their sole kind of agenda by themselves.
And sort of building on that theme, we have another question related to elections. I think clearly this is on everyone's mind, and I think reasonably so. It's the connection between last week's return of Rizek Shihab and this idea that, well, why, the timing, is it strategic? And then how does this play looking forward to local elections coming up and then presidential in 2024?
So the timing is quite funny. I don't think it's strategic. I have a feeling that he is somewhat overstayed his welcome. There's been many cases where Saudi Arabia kind of wanted to see the back of him, and there's been many cases that he was going to turn up in Jakarta and didn't. When these crowds suddenly formed at the airport, a part of me was like, is it going to happen? Is it not? And he did turn up this time. So I don't think it's necessarily completely strategic. I don't think he's trying to influence December's kind of elections as we see them. But having said that, I mean, he has turned up at an opportune moment. There are elections happening. We're approaching 4 years since the big gatherings in Jakarta against Ahok. And we're already seeing kind of tension between the kind of provincial government and the FPE, the Islamic Defenders Front, on whether they can gather in the streets. Obviously, with COVID relations, everyone's telling them not to from the government point of view. But we've seen demonstrations, we've seen protests go against kind of government regulations on social distancing. And it's quite likely that some elements of the FPE are going to kind of gather on the streets come 2nd of December.
Thank you. So we have a really important question now from Dr. Elmhurst here in the UK. And I think it's the optics of this whole thing. And she rightly points out that all the figures in your presentation, Chris, are men. What role are there for women in these movements, and are there not any prominent women worth mentioning within this theme, this presentation, this talk?
It's a great question. It's a good one. In terms of these high-level kind of political dynamics, it is predominantly kind of a male audience that they're talking to in this sense, and you can see that this kind of stems especially within Salafi modernist circles and this idea of a kind of segregated public sphere. So their leaders are kind of, the men are in the public, the men are the ones proclaiming stuff, the men are the ones on the active front lines, but that doesn't necessarily mean that women are not important in these roles. You see this in kind of the healthcare initiatives that they're doing, the way that kind of women are also involved in kind of helping out too. But also in organizing these protests. I mean, I believe an anthropologist based in Melbourne, Anissa Norbetta, wrote a fantastic paper on women's groups working to kind of on this 212 kind of this anti-Ahok kind of movement and how they've kind of mobilized. So they're definitely there, but in terms of whether there's kind of a woman sitting at the top of this at the moment you can't necessarily see it. And this has to do with the kind of heavy gendered lens that they look at society through and what they're kind of promoting in this sense.
Right, excellent. But I do think clearly if you look at the various memberships, and if you look at NU, there are wings and factions and groups within which women are very active and very prominent. And you're seeing protest movements across the archipelago with women now, of course, very central. But I mean, that's a really interesting thing, and it does now occur to me also that but the imaging, the various pictures, we don't really have a female representation there.
No, I mean, that is interesting, and it's and you see this also within the kind of Salafi modernist circles themselves that have very active women's wings, that are somewhat overly critical. They are actually critical of the men of being too concerned with public image, being out on the streets doing the wrong thing, when they should actually just be a bit more active and kind of use their initiative. So they are there, definitely. But in terms of the imaging that you see, yes, it is a predominantly kind of heavily kind of male image that they're kind of putting forward.
But thank you. You also referenced an anthropologist working out of Australia, so we might look that up. Now we have another query from a PhD student here in the UK, an Indonesian student who has been following the stories very much of FPI returning, and he's saying, all right, well, to what extent is this a symbol of opposition to the government? But given all the controversy around this group, what is the likelihood that any kind of significant mobilization or opposition will actually emerge out of this?
It's a good question. I think when we're looking at the Islamic Defenders Fund specifically, you can see Habib Rizieq returning gives them a kind of figurehead that they didn't have quite up until for the last 3 years, basically. So everyone that's tried to kind of like emulate Habib Rizieq or kind of step into his shoes in the Islamic Defenders Front to kind of bring the movement forward has necessarily kind of failed to gain the same traction, the same type of kind of mobilization, and the same kind of bringing people to the streets, the same type of authority that you see with Habib Rizieq. So there is that potential that this will become a kind of political force of some sort yet again. But we also have to remember, and the caveat that like the Islamic Defenders Front at the moment still has kind of this pending kind of permit case over their heads that the administration's holding over them, or the Ministry of Internal Affairs. Essentially, for those, so the Islamic Defenders Front, their registration as a national organization expired last year. It still needs to be renewed. It's still in negotiation, and the fact that it's kind of pending kind of does dampen their ability to kind of oppose kind of national political figures. So there's still big question marks on how far they can go and to what extent they can kind of mobilize.
There's obviously a bit of anxiety as well, because clearly you weren't seeing a big crackdown on effectively mass gatherings at an airport at a time when, again, this is actually not permitted, but in fact was permitted. And I guess there is a sense that we don't want to escalate things at the moment, but yeah, there's a lot going on there. Yeah. We have a very nice question. First of all, somebody saying, Chris, thank you so much. This is a fascinating update on Islamism in Indonesia. And the question is about the term majoritarianism. I guess kind of unpacking this a little bit further, and to what extent does this, well, first, is this an ideology? And then to what extent, if it is, does it threaten Pancasila and democracy in the long run?
No, that's a fantastic question. Trying to get down into the kind of the weeds of what Muslim majoritarianism is. I suppose this is a term that's kind of been bandied about quite a lot in what we are seeing in the kind of prominence of kind of Islam within the political and public spheres, not just in Indonesia, but in places like Malaysia. And the idea that this is somewhat coherent or part of the kind of national ideology. So this is why it's somewhat kind of different from, say, an explicitly Islamist project that wants to shift Indonesia into, and the form of government it has. I mean, it doesn't, Muslim majoritarianism doesn't want to change the fact that you have a constitution, a president, a parliament. It just wants to kind of re-emphasize and foreground the religious aspect of that and of the constitution. In this kind of as well, I think one of the kind of more finer details that you can see is this kind of idea of differentiated citizenship. So the idea that citizenship in Indonesia is for everyone, it's civic in that sense, but your level of access is somewhat kind of dependent on your commitment to different religious values or your religious beliefs. In terms of Pancasila, this is kind of an interesting kind of battle that's playing out, and something that I'm trying to write a bit about at the moment, is the fact that the government has been very proactive in painting these groups as anti-Pancasila. And we saw that with the kind of new Pancasila law. We've seen that through kind of statements by different government officials of the idea that this is kind of Indonesian Pancasila nationalism, kind of like civic nationalism and kind of plurality versus this new kind of Islamism of some sort. The flip side of that is that a lot of these Islamic groups themselves see themselves as pro-Pancasila. They see Pancasila, they're trying to reorientate the kind of the grounding and understandings of Pancasila to kind of emphasize the religious part of it. So they don't see themselves as anti-Pancasila, they see themselves as within this national ideology. And this is one of those fascinating battles that we've seen in kind of post-Suharto or democratic Indonesia, where Pancasila itself, the national ideology, has somewhat kind of become a bit more flexible of how you interpret it, who gets to interpret it, and in what type of way. So in terms of whether they're anti or pro-Pancasila, it depends on who you ask, really, and your interpretation of Pancasila. But it's fascinating that this is the groundwork that they're fighting on now. They're fighting to show that they are Pancasila themselves, not outside of it.
And it is interesting because I think as most of the audience will be well aware, I mean, these 5 guiding principles, the essence of an independent nation, it's not surprising that they're flexible and interpretive and very broad. And in a sense, it's almost impossible to be anti-Pancasila. You can always find, you can always peg yourself to part of it, maybe not all of it, right? Yeah. So I think perhaps this is also a reflection of just how difficult it was to establish an independent Indonesia and have a very overarching sense of this is what brings us together. And now we're finding that as nation building progresses, as a sense of being Indonesian progresses, the problem we have is that this is actually very broad.
Mm-hmm. Oh, definitely. And on that point as well, David Butcher in Australia, he wrote a fascinating kind of book. Sorry, I forgot which university in Australia, but he wrote a fascinating book on the history of kind of like Pancasila and ideology throughout the kind of early independence to the Suharto era, to just show you how these debates were kind of happening and the kind of different legal interpretations that were being drawn upon, and ideas as well of culture and religion. And it just shows you exactly how interpretive and how kind of elastic it can sometimes be.
Excellent. So we're getting close to the hour. We've got 5 minutes remaining. I think while we're filtering through the final questions, and please do, anybody in the audience, take this final opportunity to write to Chris. I think we're, obviously the conclusion we can draw is that Jokowi is still in a strong position. His ratings are, the polls, the opinion polls look strong. His rating is strong. He's still fairly much, in the early stages of the second term. So presumably this isn't an ideal time to launch a full-on assault on this administration. And clearly the positioning meant that Jokowi's running mate quieted down a lot of the noise around, questioning Jokowi's character, his Islamist credentials, his closeness to China, questioning his ancestry, all of this. I think that's probably gone slightly quiet. But what's going to be interesting is the maneuvering ahead of 2024, because we're going to see a new set of candidates emerging. And this is going to be where perhaps some of these notions of figureheads coming together and coming up with a new bargain. We're going to be looking at perhaps, we need to hear from you again as endorsements start, and as we really, in effect, people are already planning for 2024, but it's not really going to start to crystallize, for another 2 years. So I think it's going to be really interesting to revisit the questions you've raised today and look at the sort of longer term impact of these different mobilizations now. And of course, as we have public inquiries into the handling of COVID, this might play out a little bit later, because we still don't quite know the full impact, do we?
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, there's a big question mark, not just on Indonesia, but most of the world at the moment, of what does the next year or two look like economically, health-wise, because of COVID, and what does that mean for politics? So we will see. It's still early days in Indonesia, as you mentioned, but as political competition ramps up, yeah, I mean, there's a big question mark of where these groups will sit.
And I think we do need to have more of these types of public events as we approach 2024, to have a kind of final reckoning on the sort of post-COVID mobilizations, and maybe even deeper fragmentation. We will see. So this will probably be the last questions from another PhD student here in Leeds, just basically saying, are there any linkages in this kind of conservative Islamism in Indonesia to more global movements? What is the role of Saudi Arabia? There's obviously a lot of funding coming through. And are we seeing any sort of Saudi influence in some of the politics and some of the co-optation that perhaps is going on now?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and a great one to finish on as well. So in terms of influence of Saudi Arabia, but also kind of like the broader kind of global kind of Islamic movements and those kind of influences, you do see them. So for example, a lot of the Salafi modernists I talked to went to university in Saudi Arabia, the Islamic University of Medina being a prime place. This is where Bakr Nasir kind of met a lot of the other kind of Salafis as well. And we can't ignore the fact that Habib Rizek spent 3 years in Saudi Arabia up until now. So there are those links there. You do see funders and donors kind of helping on educational projects between the two. And you also see a lot of these individuals flying internationally quite a lot to kind of international Islamic conferences in places like Istanbul, for example. So there are those factors there. However, there's a big disclaimer, the fact that they aren't behest to the ideas or the kind of inspirations or the kind of the whims of these kind of national kind of governments, or kind of institutions, Islamic institutions within the Middle East or kind of further afield. They are independent actors. And when it comes to funding explicitly political activities, that's where they have to do a lot of the groundwork themselves nationally, because that's funding for political kind of activities is extremely difficult, and it's extremely dangerous for foreign governments to do that. So they are independent. They do have these links, but we have to remember that they're not kind of an arm of, say, Saudi foreign policy in any sort of way.
Excellent. So we're going to start wrapping up now. Again, we want to extend our thank you to Chris for giving us a really excellent presentation today. And just again, to remind ourselves, these are indeed very strange times. We have godly nationalists telling us to follow the science. We have technocrats in the Jokowi government saying focus on trade and the economy. And, you know, we've got these very, very profound challenges moving forward. So we want to thank our speaker again. And let's use this, you know, as a springboard to continue these fascinating threads of analysis, and then continue looking forward to 2024. So thank you very much, and we hope everybody who joined us live on Facebook was able to have their questions fielded. We thank you for everyone here on Zoom live with us for putting their questions to Chris. And all right, have a great day. It's now, you know, we're going to get on with our job this Monday morning, and we look forward to seeing all of you at the next Association of Southeast Asian Studies UK events. So watch this spot, and we'll see you know, the next feature in our webinar series. And all right, everyone, have a great day. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye now.